And good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Globalization Studies. I am Sophie Reynard-Leroy, Director of the Institute. Welcome to our last installment of our spring lecture series on the intersection of climate change and migration. Our very own Stony Brook faculty opened the series in February with an interdisciplinary panel representing sustainability, political science from a migration perspective, Africana studies, and the humanities. And we're glad it generated great discussions and questions from our audience. Last month's session raised the same questions in a panel with outside speakers in the field of climate change and migration. Today's closing session is a lecture concentrating on policies around climate change and migration with our special guest from neighboring Columbia Climate School, Susana Adamo. I'll let my colleagues Nancy Imstra and Jeffrey Santana introduce our guest speaker. But before I do, let me reintroduce these two Stony Brook colleagues who are the instigators of this spring lecture series. They're both active members of the Faculty Advisory Board of the Institute for Globalization Studies, as well as co-members of our College of Arts and Science. Nancy Imstra is an associate professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and an affiliate of Sociology and Hispanic Languages and Literature. Trained as a political and cultural geographer, her research interests include elastic border enforcement practices, detention and deportation, and how state policies shape migration patterns and decisions in Latin America. Jeffrey Santana is an associate professor of English and affiliated faculty in Asian and Asian American studies and women's gender and sexuality studies. He has research and teaching interest in Asian American and Asian Pacific diaspora studies, environmental humanities, and eco-criticism, human migration and diaspora, post-colonial criticism, and critical ethnic studies. He's a co-editor and contributor of the book Empire and Environment, Ecological Ruin in the Trans-Pacific, forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. Nancy and Jeff, thank you again for a great semester of programming. You now have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks to all of you for coming to this third event. And I just wanted to thank Jeffrey for the honor of working with you on this panel. It's been very enjoyable. And Jeffrey and I have, we conferred ahead of time, and I have the honor of introducing Dr. Adamo. So I will do that now. Dr. Susana Beatriz Adamo is a research scientist and adjunct assistant professor at the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, an environmental data and analysis center within the Columbia University Climate School, specializing in the human aspects of global environmental change. She is also co-coordinator of the Population Environment Research Network, member of the Climate Change Working Group of the Group on Earth Observations GEO, and former member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. She holds a BS in Geography from the University of Buenos Aires, an MS in Population Studies from Flaxo, Mexico, and a PhD in Demography and Sociology from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Adamo's research interests spread across several fields: environmental migration and displacement, social vulnerability and environmental change, dynamics of internal migration in developing countries, and all aspects of data integration related to demography and environment links, particularly global and regional geo-referenced population databases. Among other projects, she has worked on the development of gridded population databases, including topics such as distribution, basic demographic characteristics and net migration, vulnerability and climate variability in Latin America, migration, cities and climate change, vulnerability to winter storms and air pollution in the U.S. Northwest, and land use and population change in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we are indeed very honored to have Dr. Adamo as a guest today, speaking on the topic of policy applications of climate mobility research. Thank you very much, Dr. Adamo.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you all the organizers for inviting me, to giving me this opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to share my screen so for the presentation. So the topic is policy application of climate migration research, and I was explaining to the organizer that I haven't worked on policy applications. As a researcher, we always worry about how our results are going to be useful. So I want to approach the conversation today as a reflection of how research funding and research results could actually be used to inform action, to inform different courses of action. So that would be my intention today. And I want also to start with there was a presentation by Elizabeth Ferris in 2015. Elizabeth Ferris is a political scientist working on on migration international policy, and she was one of the how we can say the driver, the forces behind the Global Compact of Migration, working on that for a very early stages. And she had this presentation about the dilemmas to confront in order to understand migration in the context of climate change. And she presented these 4 dilemmas that you can see in the screen about the policy related to climate change and migration that belongs to different arenas. What are the strategies that could be used to actually influence policy? What do we want policymakers actually do? So what exactly is the objective of the policy? But the one that catch my eye as a researcher is understanding that migration in the context of climate change is not an easy thing to do. It's multi-causal, there are not a clear definition, and particularly the numbers are uncertain. And all these characteristics are not good for talking with policymakers because it's too much noise in order to actually use this. So I wanted to use this as kind of an introduction of what is the dilemmas, because most of the research in climate migration is telling you one thing, but depending on the context, other thing could be true as well. In terms of the climate migration research, this is going to be the first part of the talk. And then in the second part, I'm going to be talking more about the actual policy implication. But I wanted to start with this research. And one characteristic of the research in migration climate change has been the sharp increase that happened around 2010 approximately. And you can see that in this particular graph, number of publications and case studies on migration and climate change between 1970 and 2016. And it's very clear how starting around 2007, 2010, in that period, there is a huge increase in research and particularly in publication related to climate and migration, particularly. Environmental migration, there was research before, but these are the ones about climate and migration that started. And there were several causes for this. There were several studies looking at how this happened, why the sudden interest on this. And then McLeman and Jimen are talking about 3 characteristics that I think could explain what happened. One is that this increasing awareness on part of society at what could be the extent and implication of environmental degradation and climate change or human well-being. So that would be this kind of first element. The second is that there are more and more also awareness that climate change is going to have implications for human mobility. And then also the interest on security repercussions of environmental change that could be a threat multiplier. And that would be more on the security or securitization of migration discourse, but it still was one of the elements that these authors identify as the one that were behind this sharp increase. In terms of what is the nature of the hazard that we are implying, and I'm going to explain why the hazard is important. Climate change is here to stay. I think that the last IPCC report made that very, very clear. And we're talking about the climate change as defined by the UN Framework for Climate Change, Convention for Climate Change, as a change in climate that is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity and that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and is in addition to the natural climate variability. And I mentioned that this is the definition of the convention because it's slightly different than the definition of the IPCC. And what it's saying is that even when we can reach the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 centigrade, which seems very unlikely, the disruption to social and economic system is going to be still substantial. There are going to be an increase in natural disasters, and that could result in disruption of food production system, natural ecosystem, and the global economy, a global transformation of the planet. And it is the issues that raise question of habitability, how different places could be deemed not suited for habitability, for staying, and that is what in the end could affect migration, mobility, and result also in displacement and for migration. And the graph on the right is just showing the observed and simulated trend in global warming compared with the simulated when there are not action of global warming. And this is important because if we want to understand how environmental factors affect the migration decision, we need to have some kind of framework. And I have selected the RISK framework, talking about what environmental hazard and social vulnerability, explaining or creating the risk, and then the risk resulting in an action and a response, and this response could be demographic response in terms of population mobility. But this is going to be affected by a number of different elements. Since we can consider government responses, the past experience with migration in a particular place, what is the perception that a population, individual, households, family, farmer has in terms of environmental hardship, and also what other responses are available at the same time in the same place. In this case, we can talk about the population mobility as one possible demographic response. So when we put this in the context, and of course we have the feedbacks because this is happening in certain places at a certain point in time, and it's a process, so we also have to consider the time dimension. Now, if we talk in terms of other factors, this is a different framework, but is completely coherent with the one before. There is multiple factors, and this is one of the elements that makes it so difficult to explain the results and to use the results. This pentagram was put together by the Foresight report and then published by Black and others in 2011, and it's showing the many different factors that could affect. All of them could be acting at the same time. One could be the more prominent one, but still the others are still important if we talk at the macro level. And then also there are intervening factors, constraints or facilitators at the meso level, at the individual level, at the micro level, at the moment of the decision. And then there's two possible overall outcomes that could be to migrate and to stay. So this framework that has been broadly used is putting together all the complexity that you can find when you're trying to explain how environmental factors could act in terms of explaining mobility. And on top of that, climate change is affecting all these different drivers. So complexity. And this is what happens. So I'm just putting here some selected research about, and those are empirical results. And one of the things that happened is that there is this general belief that poor households are the ones that are going to be migrating the first, but actually the research is showing that poor household, the poorer household in place are probably the ones that are not going to have the resources to live. And that when another popular concept started to emerge, that is trapped population because they cannot live. Also that climate change or climate change related impact could affect one type of mobility more than others. The type of event, slow onset or sudden onset, has different type of impacts, and they are not linear. So the impact could be direct and sudden, or they could take some time to happen, and they could have a breaking point and produce a sudden response after a lag of several months, or even it could be years that happened in some of the research about drought. Again, regarding the different type of event, the extremely high temperature and dry condition could increase migration in certain areas, but not in others. So the prevalent kind of livelihoods in the place, is there farmers or no, if there was already certain types of mobility in place, as also important to explain the outcome. Certain groups could be more likely to end up being trapped, for example, women in some particularly low-income countries in Africa. And then also there have been a lot of reviews because of this large amount of research, looking at how we can summarize this. And this is a report by Selby and others that put together these 5 hypothetical pathways to explain how climate impact could explain migration. And this is just summarizing some of the results. So the short-term events, the long-term events could be the one that are explaining, and also could be some mobility that is related and mitigation plans put in place, like dams or resettlement program. But they also discovered that the perception and the narratives around migration could explain the outcome. The results could also be very different according to what is the geography that we are trying to address. And the geography could be defined in terms of countries, in terms of administrative units, or in case of this particular research that our center realized some time ago, like almost 10 years ago now, in terms of ecosystems, how the different ecosystems could have different kind of migration trends. And in the case, the graph is just showing what is the estimated net migration per different continents in drylands. And as you can see, the outcomes are different. This is a model, is not an observation. And in North America, we have that in the 3 decades that we consider, the 1970s, the 80s, and the 90s, the net migration was positive, while in most of the others is negative. And then we have to remind about all the internal migration in the United States going to the Southwest, for example. The research also has focused on some type of mobility more than in other. This is related now to the groundswell report, 1 and 2. And this particular report focused on internal mobility, internal migration, because previous research has shown that this is going to be, or has been so far, the prevalent way of mobility in response to climate impacts. This is model research and is projecting into specific scenarios into the future using what is called the shared socioeconomic pathway and different options in terms of emissions. And what you are looking at to the right is what are for the different scenario, what are the projections in terms of what we call climate migration, that is the difference between scenarios that include the climate impacts and scenarios that do not include the climate impacts. And what we see is that in general, there is a trend to growing over time, but also that the results are different according to the level of population growth or population dynamics and the level of emission that we are considering. So this is a different way of looking at things, and this is all about internal migration. And of course, we also need to consider that the results are going to be different according to the different areas that we are talking about. So there is a spatial distribution of the impacts and also a spatial distribution of where the hotspot, as we call it, for positive and negative net migration could happen. And we have here 2 examples. Red are areas that are expected according to our model to be areas where net migration is going to be positive, and the blue, the one that we are expecting it to be negative. And we have East Africa to the left and North Africa above the graph. Also, we have a difference of scale. We can go to the city level. This is work in progress that we are conducting right now in terms of climate migration in Africa. And the results at the city level could be quite different at the regional, the national, or administrative one level. This is for the city of Dakar, again, using a model projection. From 2020 to 2050, we have a different set of scenarios in this case. But most of the scenarios show that if our model is correct, and we are only considering a limited set of input for the model, because of the impact, particularly of sea level rise, Dakar is a coastal city. Because of that, this projection showed that net migration or this kind of climate migration would be negative. It doesn't mean that the population of Dakar is going to decline. It's that it could be interpreted that population in Dakar is not going to be growing as fast or as much because of mobility or migration into the city. Now, so those are all results. Some of them go along, some of them are contradictory. There is a lot of influence of the time horizon that we are using. If we are talking about processes or we are talking about cross-sectional, if we're talking at different scale, global, regional, country, city level, different groups that are exposed to the risk and are able or not able to migrate. So how we put this in a framework or have some kind of outcome, how we can have some outcome that could actually be used for policy. So let's go back to the Foresight report. And already the Foresight report has put together this following graph, if you want, where they are saying, okay, what are the challenges to policy if we are talking about this particular framework, this particular conceptual framework. And moving at a state, both of them has represent challenges to policymakers. In the case of those that move, they can choose to move, and this is what they call migration, or they could be forced to move, and that could be displacement. And both of these have operational challenges in terms of increasing the volume of the migrants, and geopolitical challenges that has to do where these migrants are going and what kind of support these migrants could need, and how that, and this is going this to be internal or international, what are the legal framework that has to be applied. And in the case of those that stay because they are unable to leave or because they chose to stay, there are also challenges to policy, but these are different challenges because it means that if these populations are exposed to certain hazards, their need to support, their need to services, to keep the services in the face of the impact of disaster, and those that are unable to leave that even need more support because they may not have the resources to cope with the particular kind of impact, and those that decide to stay, they may need also support in terms of legal action, for example, certain kinds of flooding policies or other kind of insurance that they may need. So I like this particular, how we can go from, okay, these are the conceptual framework, this is the possible outcome, and those outcomes, each of them pose a different kind of challenge to policymakers. Another reflection I was doing, and that's something that has interested me for a while, is in terms of the intersection that we have for different marks of vulnerability, the immobility that is missed in most of the research in terms of migration and climate, and what are the possible policy responses among these, because this is talking about what is not evident in the result, is what is missing from the result, if you want. And one of those is, and is something that has been raised again and again, is that climate mobility research needs to be moving away from this idea that migration is an undesirable trend and that has to be managed, and that a symbol of maladaptation. And still understand that all this could be true, and then what is needed is to embrace the complexity and understand what is true in each of the different cases. We know that most of the patterns are going to be short distance and in-country migration, and still some population is going to be moving cross-border. So both need to be considered. In addition to that, human mobility is part of everyday life. It's not something that just appeared because climate change started having a number of impacts and disaster impact in different places. It was there before. Research about migration was there before. So that's something that also needs to be considered. And in that case, it's part of any development plan, it's part of anything that has to do with human development, with the sustainable development goal. And finally, this time the migration is included in the human development, in the sustainable development goals. And policy needs to recognize this. It's not about exceptional situation. It's about a new driver, if you want, a multiplier, a stressor, a situation that were already there. And then also, and this is very important, these intersecting social factors that influence mobility and immobility, and need to be considered in the research. And this is a known graph, but I think it's also very useful because we have the identity markers and dimension of inequality between gender, class, ethnicity, age, race, disability. This is just a short list. But these are intersecting. These are always intersecting with each other, and they're not acting individually. And this intersection is what creates a multidimensional vulnerability that results on population being either privileged or marginalized, all this spectrum, and being more or less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I also like this quote by Blakey et al., also an old quote, but it's putting all these conceptual and abstract framework into the concrete space and time of everyday life, the concrete points in space and time where all these came together every time that you have like a nuanced flooding or you have a storm that interrupts your everyday life. So both things are true, and this is something that needs to be included, going from the very abstract conceptual to the everyday life where the impact has to be understood, and where also mobility is something that happens constantly. Another element is this invisibility, as I mentioned, and what is not obvious when you are looking at research. Trapped population or population that is not moving was not included in the research for a long time, but now we are going back to this idea of the migration system where everybody, those that move, those that do not move, are included because all are part of the system. And particularly when we have households where just one individual, one member move, it means that we have this combination of people moving, but having the family in the place of origin. So that also has to be included. Piguet et al., that's where the graph that I showed at the beginning coming from. They also talk about selected geography. So there is a lot of research about climate migration and displacement and trapped population about the global south, but not on the global north. But in the global north, there's a lot of research related to managed retreat that does not include almost any case in terms of the global south. So we have this kind of selected geography that seems to be approached with very specific kind of framework. And also we have legal framework that, because of the definition of who is entitled, for example, to protection under the definition of refugee, leaves people out. And this is a huge discussion about particularly the global compact of refugees. And this select visibility and invisibility is influencing policy development, and particularly leading to the securitization of climate mobility. And this is a quote from Boas et al. It's about a paper about climate myth. And there is a danger that migration policy will continue to be based on weak scientific evidence that reinforce forces and self-perpetuate myth of climate change migration as a looming security crisis. So that's one of the issues when we have these kind of nuances or kind of characteristic of research results, and we are not paying attention to those. There's also a number of development framework for the international development cooperation that could be applied to climate mobility, particularly because this framework could provide, or this action, aid donors and others could provide resources and data and information related to climate mobility, because they are in the ground when some of the impact happened. So that's an important consideration, and that connection between climate mobility and development, but in a particular setting, and also, but also imply that there are two different legal frameworks and two different set of rules that seems to apply to every case. And this particular group of authors are advocating for having an integrated framework, and also for a kind of policy-oriented research that is looking at what is the development dynamics in the climate mobility hotspots and destination, and also what are the transnational ties that could help development, and not only including the diaspora, but other kind of ties, transnational ties. And then in terms of the city level, these are policy implications that result from work that we did for the Migration Council related to Central America and Mexico. And we were looking at what are the policy implications and the impact that could happen in terms of climate mobility for urban areas in Central America and Mexico. And one of the, and this particular policy implication, this was written by Ama Francis. And one thing that is important is when we are talking at the local and city level, it's important that the coordination of policy with the state level and the national level. So there is not incongruences or contradiction, and there is a real agreement from the ground all the way up to the more macro policy at the state federal level, depending on the country. And this is because municipalities, the municipal level is the one that is in close contact with the population, the one that is in close contact with the resident, the neighbors, and they are the one that has to implement in the end the policy. It's important, this coordination. And so Ama put together the three recommendations in terms of engagement, of course, in all the global and subregional processes that shape migration, to be very sensitive to how the different regulation at the local level could increase or decrease exposure and vulnerability, and also to work with the national level government as appropriate. And finally, I wanted to talk very briefly about experience I have with the Groundswell report. In addition to have all our model work, we also have in-country consultations. And I was very fortunate to participate in the consultation in Mexico. That's one of the consultation in Oaxaca. And it was very interesting, and I think that is one way of bridging or sending bridges between the research result, the research community, and the policy outcome that could have. Because asking the stakeholders, asking the policymakers, what do you think about this research? It makes sense to you. Do you think that this is correct according to your experience of what is going on here? And that was very rich. And as it's here, they said that these local subject matter experts and their input were very, very important to calibrate the interpretation of our modern results, and also to fine-tune the messages that this Groundswell report wanted to convey. And they could agree or not, and we have cases where some of the results were not agreed upon. They were thinking, yes, your model could say that, but really, I mean, we don't see that right now. It could be in the future, but right now we are not really aware of that. And also, in some cases, also questioning some of the decision in terms of the modeling, other modeling work. So I think this going to the ground, involving stakeholders in an actual capacity, the co-production of knowledge, but also the co-interpretation of the results, I think are very important for them moving into the policy arena. And this is just my last slide. Climate change is already affecting mobility of all types. That's something that there is growing and growing agreement, including longer-term migration. But the climate signal in migration is not going to be the only one, and is always going to be in combination with some other factors. In general, the society and institutions are considered to be ill-prepared to meet this challenge, but that depends completely on what is the local circumstances and the context circumstances. Understanding migration is also understanding why people decided not to leave, and that is something that more and more research is recommending, included in policy, but also in research frameworks. What is the relation between adaptation and mobility, and adaptation and development and mobility is important. What kind of adaptation strategy? Is that the livelihood strategy? Is a coping strategy? So that's important to consider. And also the subjective dimension. What is the perception and the narrative that they're playing into considering mobility as a good or bad element? And in the end, the objective of research should be at some point to bring the issue of the potential impact of climate change on population distribution to the attention of the policymakers in a way that make it easy, not only to understand, but incorporate that particular input. Thank you so much.
Dr. Adamo, thank you so much. This is Jeffrey Santa Ana. We do have time to ask questions. We want to focus those questions from the audience members, but Nancy and I did come up with some questions that we'd like to ask briefly before we actually turned to the audience questions. I was going to ask you, and I still want to ask you, Dr. Adamo, a question about hope, but particularly, and it's a question that we've been asking all of our panelists in this series. So it's important to still ask that question, but particularly at this very difficult time. One of the things that you emphasized in your talk repeatedly, of course, is how policy on climate change and migration must take into account, of course, global factors, right? Since of course, the issue of climate change is a global issue. And nothing speaks to that more compellingly and disturbingly, of course, than what's happening in Ukraine. So the question that I want to ask is of course, as you continue to undertake your research on climate change and migration, but especially with regard to policy, what does give you hope, right? But how you also, and I always want to ask this because I don't often have the opportunity to talk to a scientist, especially one whose work focuses on climate change, since I work in the humanities. And what I work with in the humanities is a lot about questions pertaining to politics. Do you feel that it's important? Because one of the things that you emphasized in one of your last slides was climate change and migration in terms of policy must take into account other factors. And I'm curious to know factors pertaining to politics, particularly geopolitics, right? So how is it important for scientists to speak out, right, against war, against militarist aggression? A lot of of course, the evidence that we're seeing that is contributing to climate change is actually coming from the work of scientists who are showing us how wars for oil or wars that are underwritten by oil are significant contributions to climate change, which then cause not only migration, but refugeeism. So I want to ask you the hope question about what gives you hope, but I also want to ask you the political question. Do you feel it's important for climate scientists, right? Scientists and social scientists to also be political, to include in policy, right? Statements that speak out against war and militarist aggression. So that's my question. Thank you again, Dr. Adamo.
Should I answer now or wait for another question? Okay. Well, that's a difficult question. I am a social scientist, and I am social scientist from the global south. So that gives me a very particular, a particular point of view about that. And when I think about that, I go into my experience with the dictatorship in Argentina. So it's important to speak up, because silence could be deafening. So if silence could mean that you agree when you are not. So it's important to do that. And that will be my position, to express your opinion, to make it clear that not everything is okay, that things are fine, that the war has to be denounced everywhere that happen. Because if not, how I can say that, if not, victims have no voice, and if not, it seems that nothing could be changed. So I think that part is important. So it's important to speak up for what you think is right, but also to denounce what you think is not right. So that would be my experience. That in terms of climate change, and particularly in terms of mobility and climate change, it is a geopolitical issue when it crosses boundaries, and that's where I think that it's not a political issue because of climate change. It's a geopolitical issue because there is a boundary that is crossed. And the issue is that if you look at what are the reasons why someone, and that's the Refugee Convention, and that's a lot of discussion about that. And when I was talking about invisibility, the convention does not recognize still climate change, any kind of disaster, any kind of environmental reason, a reason for refugee status at the global level. There are certain regional conventions that do recognize that. But in that sense, it's not because it's climate migration, it's because it's international migration, and that has become more and more and more politicized and securitized. And so I think that I don't know if I'm being clear. It's not because it's climate change what is inducing migration. It's because it's crossing boundaries, and sometimes if there is flee because of a disaster, they are not trying to go through the protocols, they're getting a visa. And I remember now there was when the earthquake hit Haiti, and Haitians were not able to cross to Dominican Republic. So there was all these issues, all this history, this kind of engraved history where they were depicting what's going on there. So the geopolitical question is important. And I want to come back to something that you said. Global change is global. So the global climate change is global, but the impacts are local. And I remember this because there was something that someone told me that was a huge mistake that the community, the scientific community, the international community has made to make global change a global issue. That's fine, but not to make the case at the same time that all the impacts are local. And that's this kind of contradiction between where the impacts are going to happen and where the discussions sometimes are happening. I think this is important. And a long time ago, when I was in graduate school, we have this environment and population course, and also it was very similar to this, that the causes of the disaster and the consequences of the disaster are going to be separated in two different places usually, and that I think. And before climate change, although not the same scale, we have the ozone hole. That was also a very specific location where this was happening, but it was because of the global process of use of certain kind of gases. So I think that particular question of scale, the scale of the impact, the scale of where the damage is being produced and where the impact is going to happen, where the exposure is happening, where the vulnerabilities lie, I think is very important. And it's starting to emerge even in developed countries in terms of managed retreat. Who can actually retreat? What kind of resources you need for doing that? So I think those questions are very important. And in terms of hope, I always have hope, and that could make me a complete idealist. But you need to go. And after COVID, even more. I think that that tested the system and showed that the system is not very good. That's my very particular personal opinion. But also that things evolve. And we cannot expect to go back to the same old, although we would like to. So that will be my response. Things evolve, and the problem is how and who could actually keep going. So
thank you so much.
The question is a very profound question. So yeah.
I see Galia has questions, so I'm gonna turn it over to Galia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I just so enjoyed this talk. I had a lot of thinking about this. Also, as a researcher, political scientist on climate migration, very, very helpful way of breaking all of the policy relevant mishaps. One thing, a simple question I would like, if it's possible, if you wouldn't mind sharing any of the PowerPoints of your research, because you've introduced so many great insights. I'd like to review some of your major points. There is a question that I wanted to ask you. I thought in my own research, I've been having trouble locating the group of people, as you say, those that are trying to leave, those that are stuck in the middle, and those that are actually climate migrants. Right? I really wonder where and how you would conceptualize those people that not necessarily choose to stay. As we know, climate migration is also, especially disaster, also pressures people to stay rather than leave. What about those who are trapped in third countries or elsewhere that have essentially what I would call the immobile, those people that have the same motivations to flee climate change, but their mobility has been sort of impeded, either by policies or by economic forces, local opportunities. I'm really wondering how you might be thinking about where you would put the line of mobility and immobility, right? So that's one question. And another very last, I wanted to mention that you're right. I think that the framing of this kind of climate migration, the narrative, is very, very key. And it's true that there is a selected visibility, as you called, in the policy agenda. But ironically, would you say that because securitizing any form, whether it's migration or climate migration itself, is the way that issues become prevalent, salient, right? Issues in most political agendas are not salient until they become national threats, until they are framed or accepted as threat. Is it possible that putting climate migration as a threat, it could actually make the part that you are encouraging, information seeking, maybe putting it sort of on the agenda, more likely than less? What, in other words, what's wrong, or what do you think about the idea that climate migration can be so-called securitized?
Okay. Oh, two different questions.
Those are my very quick questions. Probably the PowerPoint question might answer all of the questions once I get to really look very closely. So if you want to not take that on, just send the PowerPoints and I'll be in contact.
Just very quickly, the line between mobility and mobility, that's a very good question. And that's, for me, in terms of research, is how you design your research and how you define who is a migrant. And that's it could be completely arbitrary. So a migrant could be a mobile person, a mover, depending what you could be someone that leave a place for 1 month or more, or it could be someone that just commute to the city, or it has to be 6 months away in order to be considered migrant. And those are the classical issues about defining your object of study. So, and now, different is when you want to consider is there are people that are not living on the face of a disaster, and that is about using secondary data and saying, okay, how this particular data set is talking about displacement and the people that stay put. So those are the like different questions, and also depend what kind of data you have. Often what you have is surveys. Those are the ones that you can go and ask people actually, and others where you can indirectly try to see if there was an effect. So there are more people living because of disaster. So those are the classical research questions. In terms of that could be securitized, I think that is already securitized, but it has a lot to do with this idea of the mass migration crossing borders. So there's a narrative behind that, and there's a lot of discussion, particularly in Europe, more and to let's say extend here about how climate migration is portrayed in the media, and these recurrent images of very poor people in Africa in the middle of the dusty road without water. I mean, this recurrent idea. So I think that is something there that this has been amplified. It's like not so much now, but there was a time like a decade before where it was all about numbers. How many people are we considered? How many million, billion, trillion of people are moving? So I think that has related.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful.
We do have another question that's in chat by Mark Montgomery. Mark, if you're there, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Susana. It's a real pleasure to see you and to hear such a beautifully integrated presentation.
Nice to see you. So time.
Yes. So like Galia, I'm struck by a theme in what you in your talk that we so seldom hear in sort of journalistic accounts of climate and migration. The theme being people who do not move, whether because they cannot move or they, for one reason or another, choose not to move. And I'm wondering if you can point us to any literature that differentiates, rural villagers who are either trapped or, are making the best of where they are, as against, urban slum dwellers, disadvantaged neighborhoods that are repeatedly struck by floods and whatnot, and who, again, maybe have no alternative within their city, or on balance, see where they are, risky as it is, as the best, option for them at the moment. There's also a measurement question, especially for the latter case, because when people change neighborhoods in a city, as you very well know, we don't call them migrants. That's somehow a different category of residential mobility. And so they drop out of even our meager statistics. Anyway, I'd be very interested in anything you can point us to on these rural urban differences.
Oh, that's an excellent question, Mark. And again, it's so nice to see you for being so long. There has been a focus on rural settings, and that's because of the worry about the impact of climate change in terms of water availability, in terms of agriculture, in terms of food security. So there is a real focus on that. And the way that you treat immobility could be a little different. There are more and more work in terms of immobility. I think in terms of Caroline Siggraf for the Hugo Observatory. She's one of the ones that started working very consistently on this, but also Helen Adams. I think that is in some place in the UK. Helen has a paper on place attachment and immobility in Peru. And she's explaining this situation where you are, and that's after I read her paper for 2015 that I started looking into voluntary immobility. And there's also a lot of debate about talking about trapped population and what is said in terms of agency. So that's where we have now this more voluntary and involuntary mobility. So Helen Adams and Caroline Siggraf are the two that I know more that are working on these issues, but there are more and more research on this. Attention to urban setting is relatively new, and I'm pushing for that because I think that it's a complete gap in the literature. I have a colleague in the Colegio de Mexico, Landy Sanchez, and she's working, and Landy is working on how the impacts of climate change in the urban setting that seems to be like what exactly could happen, like just a little rain, is affecting informal vendors that work on the street, for example. So I think that's that urban setting is still missing. There are research that is related to the immobility of the elderly during the heat waves, the famous case in Chicago. I think it was Chicago. There was a heat wave and there was elderly population in low-income setting buildings that had no access to air conditioning or any kind of relief, and so they were like trapped in that. But urban is a place where there's a lot of research that still could happen. There is more attention also because of the managed retreat and the attention to the nuanced flooding, this kind of tidal flooding that is not like a huge high tide flooding of feet, but just is smaller than that, but it's interrupting like streets, going into basement. And I think that bringing the attention to the urban settings, and also in terms of the winter storms, in terms of the storm surge in the coastal areas, in terms of the sea level rise. So there are more attention to urban areas, although still comparing with the rural, there's still an imbalance there, but it's getting more attention. And also I think it has to be, because rural areas are changing, are not all dependent on agriculture, so it has to be more nuanced, so it's not only that. And then also you have the more and more people living in urban areas.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, NGOs on climate migrants. I had to look for it. I know that they are more and more working with migrants I'm not really sure about climate migrants, but one way to look at that is the platform for disaster displacement and what are the members of the advisory committee, because it includes a lot of different, so that could be one way to start.
Galia has asked also about the name of the researchers that you just mentioned in answer to Mark's question.
Yeah. I hope that I write in Carolina name. Yeah.
Thank you again. Do we have other questions from anybody in the audience?
Jeff, I have a question I'll ask.
All right.
If there's still a little bit of time. Susana, it sounds like you are working with just an amazing group of different researchers in all these networks doing all this really critical work to kind of be parts of teams studying different things. And I gathered from your talk that you really feel like it's important that kind of local level people are pulled into these sorts of research endeavors and collaborations. So, I was wondering, like, what are the challenges of doing that type of local level collaboration? And then a second part to that question would be like, are there other people, other groups that you really feel we need to be working with on climate change research and just haven't been able to pull them in or reach them for various reasons, and what could we do to correct that?
I think that in terms of working with stakeholders, with local communities, I think that you have to, but also depends what kind of research you are doing. But more and more, particularly if you want to go into policy, you need a different perspective that is not only academic. That was my learning when I was in Mexico. One of the groups has scientists, and they were very critical, but also policymakers from different levels. And their perspective is different because they have different needs and they are seeing different processes. So I think it's important to incorporate that. In terms of problems, it takes time, and it's not the time of academia. And I think so you go to the field for 1 week and you want to do everything, and they're looking at you like, we don't have time for that now. That's not relevant for us. You need to, respect other people's time. And then, so it takes time, but there is more and more need for that. NSF has this broader impacts statement that you need to do, and that needs more and more involvement for communities, stakeholders, and you just not just pull some boilerplate. So you actually need to think about that and what it means to involve a stakeholder from the beginning, how long it's going to take, do you need a letter? Are you actually talking with someone there, or you don't have any contact? And then, so I think it's important, particularly for policy elements and outcomes. It doesn't always has to be the community on the ground, but it has to be, in terms of policy, decision makers. So what are the needs that they have, or what they are asking, or why this particular research is not appealing, or trying to explain that this is important and why it's important. So there is a number of issues. And for me, it's actually this, it takes time, and it makes you to have to explain things that for you are so obvious that you just don't have the word for that. So it's a good training in that sense, that you have to translate your work into other elements. And not all research is going directly to policy, but if you want that to happen it's necessary to take the time, the resources, and that's important. There have to be resources for that also.
Thank you. I see that, Galia, you have a follow-up question. Go ahead.
I do. You triggered my thought. First, I might have missed this, but what is your background? What are you? You're a demographer, right? Sociology, from the sociological.
Yeah, I define myself like a social demographer in the sense that I'm not a formal demographer going into
Okay.
that kind of thing. My first background, my bachelor degree was in geography, and then
Okay.
population studies, and then into demography.
Okay.
I really, really like being a demographer. I really connect through, I mean, my research on the population and so on. I think that it could take you everywhere. But that's
absolutely. That's an issue which I wish in the U.S. had more developed. You might know yourself that our programs in demography are very limited in this country. However, what I wanted to ask is, so I've worked. That's why I asked the question. I worked as a while in my other life. I've done quite a bit of consulting work with the population division as a single political scientist among demographers, mostly. I found it very interesting that the gap that really exists, you're right, in working on as an expert and dealing with the policy relevance and dimension. So that click that academics are removed from, and of course the policymakers are also removed from, because they don't have, for example, the expertise. They might have demographics, but they don't have the cases or the political insights. So I think you're really onto something very important. There's got to be a connection there. And I was thinking as you spoke, and why I like very much and appreciate your demographic perspective, is what kind of training could somebody have really to be able to make that leap, right? What is it about the non-academic question that somebody would need to really bring to the table? I'm asking as as I'm an academic now, more full, but also we have a lot of students here in the program who really are not aware of how much an issue like climate migration in and of itself is I wouldn't be so kitsch as to call it a sub-discipline, interdisciplinary question, but it is a thematics that our world needs to think about as we train young people, researchers, where, like, what kind of insight that can a non-academic bring to the table to understand the actual politics on the ground?
I have been an academic my whole life, so that's also difficult for me. But you mentioned a couple of lines there. One is the UN, where you have a lot of policy, but it's a different kind of policy because it's international. And UNDESA, Population Division, Statistical Division, UNFPA, particularly UNFPA, that will be a lot more about population policies than others. And then the other forum where I have been in contact with policymakers and NGOs and others are groups where you have either in an advisory committee discussion with someone, that could be the platform for disaster displacement, or going to meetings where you have policymakers at the table. And it's difficult when you are just starting because you are just not used to that. And what you need to do is different. But at the same time, because you have an academic background, you are used to a different way of thinking. And I think that is complementary one with other. So you have an analytic mind because that's why you are in academia. That's why you are studying and analyzing and collecting data and making patterns and that. But then you may not be so interested about what exactly to do with the research and in terms of how exactly you can apply that to a housing policy, for example. But a policymaker or other kind of local government official could ask you a direct question and make you to think about that. Like, okay, there are going to be this kind of population growth in this particular neighborhood. Do I need more single family housing, or do I need more like multi-generational housing? And you need to start thinking about that. And that's different from the research that you are doing because you are interested in something else. And in general, migration is very interdisciplinary, not only in terms of disciplines in the academic discipline, but also in terms of policy groups that are involved in that. So many different ministries and levels of government are involved in migration and mobility. So it is a multidimensional issue. It doesn't matter where you are standing on that. When you add climate to that, then you are bringing another group that usually is not involved in social sciences, that are the climatologists. And that's what I think is interesting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions or comments? Nancy, do you have another question you wanted to ask, or we're all done?
No, I mean, I've learned so much today, and kind of the questions that I had written down have all been addressed in one way or another. So this has just been fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Adamo.
Do you have any papers of yours? I would love to read and cite your work. You really triggered a lot of brain activity. Thank you.
Not so many papers, but I can send you what I have. I wanted to mention that I put the Belmont Forum on climate migration mobility. There's a new call. It's going on now, and the Belmont Forum has a very co-producing approach to writing proposals. So this is something, even if you are not applying, something to consider in terms of learning how to do this. And they are working with the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. But I learned a lot just having some meeting with them. And that's why I learned this idea, like it takes time and training to do this kind of work.
Wow. Did you work on the Foresight? Were you involved with any of the Foresight project?
We did one. The research we presented the one about the ecosystem, migration by ecosystem, that was commissioned by the Foresight.
Terrific. We've had a celebrity. I'm very impressed with that report, all of that project. It's a first major step in this field.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the Foresight, they really break ground with that. And was at that point, I think that the whole climate migration community was involved in that one. Every single person that we knew was there. So, and we are here at CSIN, our team has been working on this for a long time. So we know each other. And
were they all demographers or climatologists?
No, most of them are, Alex is a geographer, Ryan Sean is a geographer, mostly are geographers, and we have climate scientists, yes, too, that collaborators from Earth Institute, now Climate School.
So my colleague and I from Stony Brook, since we have to put Stony Brook on the map here, we from political scientists we have a forthcoming paper on some of the complementary additions to the Foresight report from the political science perspective, and it's coming out in the IMR, the International Migration Review.
Can you send that to me? Can you send me the link or the reference?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, actually, we have now a postdoc that is a political scientist.
Right, that's what they need. They need more political science.
There is a political science, and he's working on modeling international climate migration in Africa. So Fabien Gautier has been, he has been working on that. So I think this is really getting more and more interdisciplinary, truly.
Absolutely. That's why we have our wonderful major now that we've established at Stony Brook.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
I just put Susana's email into the chat there.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes. Sophie, you're still muted.
Apologize. I was saying exactly, and if I may interject, I would like to point to Dr. Adamo that Galia Lahab, beside being a faculty in the political science department, is also one of our key core course instructor at the degree in globalization studies and international relation, in particular the course on economic and political issues with special focus on migration studies. So I'm sure that she will feature you in that course, and it's very exciting that within the context of this degree and the institute that houses it, you two can connect and then share your common work. Another thing I want to point out that make me happy is how you made a case for interdisciplinarity, even especially at the policy level, because this is something that we're trying to do at the level of our degree here in globalization studies and international relations.
Thank
you.
Yeah, so I wanted to say again, if anybody wants to be part of the climate mobility network, just let me know. And I will ask Alex to provide a link to the next meeting that we can have. And we are about any time now to have also just a very simple website just to be able to communicate better with all the members. So. But yes, please. So Galia, I don't have your email, but if you can just send it to me, or all of you.
We'll put you in contact. We'll put you in contact. Don't worry. And for the other members of the audience who don't know who Alex is, Susana was referring to Alex de Charbonnet, who is the director of the Climate School, who originally was supposed to be the guest, but he's flying right now because he's coming back from a conference that was unplanned. And so he recommended Susana instead. So the two of them are working very closely together.
Alex is the associate director of science application here at CESI, and he is also a senior research scientist, and also is a Alson professor at several courses. So yeah.
Well,
thank you, Galia. Yeah,
thank you so much, Susana, for your time, and we have just learned so much from you. So this is a fabulous way to conclude this series on climate change and migration. So we really thank you.
Thank you very much, Susana. Indeed, we're really pleased to have had you. Thank you for the audience to be here and ask these excellent questions. And mostly thank you for our co-organizers, Nancy Himstra and Jeff Santana, who've been fabulous partners here at the Institute for Globalization Studies as advisory board. And on that note, even though we're sad that this is our last installment of the lecture series on climate change and migration, this is not the end of this interdisciplinary conversation. We may even collaborate on many other things. I would like, I would like to mention that we have other members of the advisory board who together created a conference on the global 60s in the global south that is happening in person tomorrow and Friday on our campus at Stony Brook. So if you look at the chat, our graduate assistant, whom I also want to thank very much for everything he does for us, Lance, has pasted so you can click on the link and see the program. It's a 2-day long a conference that we co-sponsor along with the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook and also the Latin American Caribbean Studies Center. We also want to promote another conference that we are co-sponsoring, but mostly organized by the Department of Sociology, a great partner of ours at the Institute. That conference is Memory in the Disciplines, Pandemics and Collective Memory, COVID as Mnemonic Seismograph. It's next, well, actually, no, it is this Friday, I'm sorry, at noon. And you can register right here with this link that Lance is giving. Don't hesitate to contact you if you need that information again in a private email. And finally, as far as we are concerned, we are meeting again next week on Thursday, April the 14th, for the book launch of one of our dear colleague, who is the chair of the history department at Stony Brook, Paul Gutenberg, who edited for Oxford University Press the Oxford Handbook of Global Drug History. He will have 2 co-moderators asking questions. They're outside speakers, and we'll have our very own Liliana Davalos from Ecology and Evolution, who will be the main moderator. So don't miss that. And I think I have covered all the announcement I wanted to make tonight. And let me thank everybody again. Wish you, you know, a good continuation of this very busy semester. It was great to see you, to have you, and everybody be well.